first speaker in this session, which is Voices from the Archives, is Associate Professor Nick Teberger. And he is an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and Chief Investigator with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Dynamics of Language. He set up the Wonkamia-Pilbara Aboriginal Language Centre and wrote a grammar of Nafsan, which is a language of Vanuatu. He is Director of the Pacific and Regional Archive for Digital Sources in Endangered Cultures. Please welcome Nick Teberger.
Thanks very much. Thank you. So we've already heard today about the wonderful word lists that are available if you go out and look at the Cook exhibition. And you know, these are manuscripts like this, and we've seen this one earlier today already, without the typo for the name. I'm going to talk to you about similar kinds of word lists today, the Daisy Bates ones, but I want to start by just quoting Bruce Pascoe, another luminary thinker and writer, Aboriginal thinker and writer in Australia, who, in discussing the journals of William Thomas, who was a protector of Aborigines in Victoria, notes that this is a priceless collection of information from the 1830s, and he said, so who published his journals? A university? A government department? His church? A private researcher? No, the Victorian Aboriginal Corporation for Languages published the papers in 2014. And he goes on to say, people can get funding to do the history of the toilet in Australia, but they can't get funding to produce primary manuscripts that are of such fundamental importance for Aboriginal, in this case, culture, but also language. So I'm going to talk about another collection of manuscripts that are here at the National Library, the Daisy Bates manuscripts, which look like this. There are lots of them. This is a collection of manuscripts that were recorded in the early 1900s. The part that I'm looking at are vocabularies, but you can see it's 51 boxes, 8 metres of shelf space. And so the problem is how to identify what's in all of this mess of stuff. And then, you know, what I wanted to be able to do was link textual versions, so make a textual version of the manuscript, link it to the image of the manuscript itself, so you could always see the page of the manuscript together with a text that you could search, and then how to deliver this and how to make text copies that people could reuse. They could download them and use them in their classroom or whatever. So Daisy Bates was a fairly controversial figure in Australia. She lived quite a long life and did a lot of work in various parts of mainly Western Australia and South Australia. Her work can be a bit problematic, and it's certainly very messy. She wasn't very organised. So it's really improved in some ways by digitisation, which allows you to bring things together in ways that weren't there in the original work. So it's this kind of material. As I say, there's lots of this material. There's really lots of this material. 24,000, so this is just section 12 of the collection, so 24,000 pages of mixed materials, handwritten manuscripts and questionnaires that she sent out, which we'll look at, and then some people sent back free-form lists. So you had structured questionnaires, you had free-form lists, and then she arranged to have this typed. So then we have the typescripts that she made of these handwritten things. So there's quite a lot of different kinds of information in the collection as well. She had 500, or Malcolm Fraser, who was the protector at the time, had 500 copies of this word list printed, and then it was distributed. And as you can see, there was over 1,600 word prompts, so words that she suggested people would write in the local language, and 193 sentence prompts. So quite a wonderful endeavour to send this out and to get it filled out. This is where these word lists were filled in and returned from. So you can see the geographic spread is mainly Western Australia, but bits in other places. And if we zoom in on the southwest of Western Australia, so the country that Kim was talking about this morning, there's really an awful lot of vocabs from the southwest, so from Noongar. So a really rich set of materials, and also a time slice, because we're looking at a particular time in history, early 1900s. So the way that it's divided up at the National Library is there are 13 sections to the Bates collection, and in the early 1980s, Isabel White published a book, which was The Native Tribes of Western Australia. This was the book that Bates always had in mind to write, but never did. But that book takes every section of the collection except section 12. So section 12 is the collection, is the set of vocabs that Bates collected. So all the rest of it was distilled and sort of normalised to some extent and put into the book that you can buy, presumably still at the National Library with your discount today. So the project then for me was to create a textual version of all of these sets of hundreds of vocab items, present the text together with the images of the source documents, provide a geographic visualisation, which you got a glimpse of just a minute ago, to be able to search all of that. Once you've got it as text, of course, you can search it, and to make a principled data set for research. So one of the problems with research around manuscripts is that people will take bits of manuscripts, they'll do some work on it, and maybe they'll publish something about it, but all the work they've done in between of analysing it, of annotating it, isn't stored anywhere, and often it's lost. So it doesn't go back to enrich the collection. And native title has been a particularly sad example of that, where lots and lots of research has been done, but not much of it has been captured back to the primary sources. These manuscript vocabularies were filled in by a number of different respondents, we'll see the number in a minute, who had varying approaches to orthographies or spelling systems, so they wrote things down in different ways. And as we heard in earlier presentations, in the early 1900s, none of this was fixed. People were using all kinds of systems. Bates then had these typed, and I then arranged to have 150 type scripts keyboarded as text geocoded, encoded in TEI XML, which I'll briefly talk about. And this allows you to do things like name entities. So within a document, you'll have people, you'll have tribe names, language names, place names, and you can encode those so you can then extract them later on and say, I want to look for something, and I know it's a place name rather than just any word in the file. These vocabs have been publicly available since the 1930s. They were given to the then parliamentary library and then acquired by the National Library, but the Bar Smith Library in Adelaide claims copyright in it. Parts of vocabs have been used in native title cases and teaching resources, all kinds of things. You know, people have dipped in and out of this collection because it is such a wonderful resource. So if we do that search and find all of the language names, this is a list of the language names that are listed in the documents, quite a lot. This is a list of the people, and this is people who are both the providers of the information, the Aboriginal people, and the recorders of the information. So she sent this out to squatters, police, magistrates, all kinds of people, but we usually get the name of the Aboriginal person as well, which is great because then people today can trace their ancestors in this collection. And these are the place names that are mentioned, many. So we can say there are around 60 language names identified in it, and of those, at the moment, I've been able to identify 35 languages and say that we think they're the languages that are actually in that collection, and so on. You can see the stats there. So a page that looks like this, and you can see on the left you've got the TypeScript version, you've got the textual version, and on the right the image of the TypeScript. But underneath that, the XML, don't get put off too much, basically there's an encoding that lets you say, okay, this here is a place name. So we've got a tag on it that says it's a place name. Here we've got a person and their role is speaker, so there's the speaker name. Here we've got an organisation type, which is a tribe, that's that. So this kind of encoding lets you enrich the text. You don't have to look at this, but the computer knows how to deal with it. And again, that's what it looks like when you get it on the screen. So the idea is if you're interested in the word for iguana, you can click on it, it'll take you to the TypeScript version of iguana, and then that will also link to the handwritten manuscript version. So here it is in something I captured earlier. You can see that as you scroll through the document, the other documents scroll. You've got a magnifying glass so you can look at the text in more detail. And you can search, of course, as you'd expect. So when you go and search for a word, in this case, jarundal, say for, you think it might be the word for dog, you'll get a certain number of results, and those link back. So, you know, it's a sort of thing that we're used to, but here dealing with these vocabs. And then, of course, there's the geographic representation of this. So here's a map. There are all the words you can select from. If we select the word for I, it'll then show you that word distributed over the map. And then you can select. What's nice about this too is you can look at the map and see similarities. So in some areas there'll be the same word, of course, and neighbouring languages will have similar words. The other great educative thing for most Australians is that there are lots of them and there are lots of languages, which unfortunately is still a message we have to get out to the general public. So this is all online. There's the URL at the bottom. You can go and have a look at it and play with it. So there are problems with the spellings, as I said. So, you know, computers don't understand that you can, how do you search for something if it's spelled 10 different ways? So we've allowed a fuzzy search. We've built a way of looking for things that are similar spellings rather than necessarily the same spelling. So here's an example. If we look for the word Bubba, we get 49 results, but if we do a fuzzy search for Bubba, we get 319 results. So that'll find words alike. You can see here, Bubba with a double B, and variations on the spelling. So this is to try and make it as easy as possible to find information. Sometimes you'll have false positives, but it's going to find more information than just looking for a string. So this was done by long collaboration with the National Library. It's been about 8 years that this project's been in development. They digitised the microfilms and I got permission from the Bar Smith Library. The TIFF images that were delivered had to be renamed, so I renamed them according to a schema, and then we built a pipeline which takes the TypeScripts, sorry, I didn't include in there, it had to be typed, which I did that by sending it to an agency to get typed. So it was fairly expensive. OCR technology, optical character recognition, wasn't really good enough to deal with these TypeScripts. Maybe today it might be easier. Anyway, it's all in a repository. We can talk about the technicalities if you want, but it's the fact of it being text means that it's going to have a long life, I hope. It's got all kinds of technology under it, which means that it can be, you know, things can be linked. You can have ontologies. You can link it off to other data sources. What we don't have at the moment is an ability to download it to doc, doc or docx and PDF, but that apparently won't be a big deal. And we still have to identify all the languages in the collection. So the future would be to encode more of the Bates collection. We're looking at section 11 now, which has all the songs, and I'm working with Clint Bracknell, who's actually Kim's nephew, on the song collection, particularly in Noongar. And if you look at the number of publications, and we get this information from AusBib, and Geraldine Triffett was here earlier, who put this information together, there are about 1,100 or more documents before 1925. There are probably more than that. And if we could, have an ambition to put all of these online and make them all accessible so that they can be used. Of course, all the time, trying to pay attention to the protocols of how we do this so that it's done in a way that's acceptable to the people whose languages are being represented in it. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. A great insight into the Daisy Bates collection. What a prolific person she was in collecting all that material. We'll come back for questions at the end of the next session before we go to afternoon tea. Our next speaker is Dr. Shirlene Robinson, who is the Senior Curator of Oral History and Indigenous Programs here at the National Library. She's also an experienced oral historian and the author and editor of a number of books, including Some Like Slavery, Queensland's Aboriginal Child Workers, 1842 to 1945. Please welcome Shirlene Robinson.
Okay. All right, thank you. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people on whose land we meet and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in attendance today. At times I might mention the names of people who have since passed away, so I would like to give people advance notice of that in case that causes distress in any way. as has been mentioned, I'm the Senior Curator of Oral History and Indigenous Programs at the National Library of Australia. And I'm relatively new to the position, starting in September. So if I haven't met you or sort of spoken to you about the collection, I'd certainly love to have the chance to do so. It's a great privilege to work in that capacity. And of course, the Oral History and Folklore collection at the National Library is a really meaningful and profound way of collecting a really vital part of Australia's heritage in a way that's very different to any other type of collection, I think. So, and talking about the Oral History and Folklore collection, and particularly about building an Indigenous collection that really does capture and speak to that rich heritage and diversity of languages, and also material that relates to language and the Pacific today. So the National Library of Australia holds the largest collection of oral history and folklore recordings relating to Australia and Australian life. We hold a total of over 50,000 hours, and we add to that each year. It's a fully digitised collection, and the original recordings that were made before the digital age are kept in a temperature and humidity controlled environment where they're very, very safe for the future. So around about 12,500 hours of material from our collection is available online, which is a wonderful innovation that means that material can be accessible to people wherever they might be in the world. So the potential for that is really quite extraordinary. And to provide a little bit of background about what we do, I've sort of stuck an image up there, which is the current recorder that we use, which is a 722, very fantastic machine, but things were very different when the Oral History and Folklore collection first began in its capacity at the National Library. And we owe a lot to the work that was conducted by a woman called Hazel de Berg. So the Hazel de Berg Hazel de Berg was a truly remarkable woman. She first used a tape recorder, the tape reels, back in 1957 when she was undertaking voluntary work relating to the Blind Book Society. And she persuaded Dame Mary Gilmore to read an introduction to her book, Old Days, Old Ways, and this recording, which lasts around 1 minute and 26 seconds, is the first of the Hazel de Berg collection. Hazel de Berg was interested in obtaining material from a wide variety of people. She was particularly interested in the arts, so there's a very strong representation in her collection from people who are in that field of endeavour, but also there's material from composers, from actors, from people in the theatre, film directors, architects, scientists, a whole lot of people from a wide variety of areas in Australian society. Also sort of local history later in life as well. She travelled across Australia, she travelled internationally, and took a fairly hefty recorder with her on a lot of those trips. And over the period of 27 years, she recorded 1,290 individuals, which is really a pretty staggering figure. But the folklore collection at the National Library of Australia is also very impressive and truly unique, and it owes a lot to the efforts and the energy of John Meredith, who began collecting in 1953 and continued up until 1995. Now, there's a long history of attempting to collect material that relates to the history and language and culture of Indigenous people in Australia and the Pacific. And I mentioned earlier the work that had been conducted by Hazel de Berg, and I think that is particularly significant here because I believe that she recorded the first oral history material that we have in language from an Australian Indigenous person. It's a particularly interesting recording, and it's one that does raise a number of questions which we'd love to know more about, but I think questions that can only be fully answered with full collaboration and involvement from Indigenous communities. So the recording that I mentioned is the one that's at the top of the slide, which is a recording, it says in Hazel de Berg's records, with a woman called Shirley Fish. It also appears that Shirley was also known as Shirley Timbry. And the recording is quite a short one. It goes for about 6 minutes, and it was conducted on the 17th of December 1959. And it's a song that's sung in language at Botany Bay, according to Hazel's notes. And after it finishes, we hear Hazel speaking, telling us that the song that has been sung by Shirley Fish is a song about an Aboriginal man who went away from Moreton Island in Queensland, and upon his return said, "My people have all passed away, I'm the only one left." So Moreton Island is the land of the Quandamooka people, who are composed of 3 distinct groups: the Nunakul, the Goonpul, and the Ngungi. And in 1976, Hazel de Burgh conducted another interview that sort of drew on this particular geographic part of Queensland when she recorded Oodgeroo Nunakul, obviously an incredibly important activist, writer and campaigner for Indigenous rights. And in that interview, Oodgeroo Nunakul spoke in detail about her background, her totem, her experience of working as a domestic servant, from the age of 13, her poetry and her involvement in the movement for Indigenous rights, and also read several poems and from her stories as well. But it would be extremely interesting and important, I think, for us to know more about Shirley Fish and how she came to know that beautiful song. It's quite a haunting song, which she sings for Hazel de Burgh in 1959. The small amount of written information that we have suggests that Shirley was from Central Australia, and as I mentioned, she sung the song at Botany Bay. So you have somebody who the information says is from Central Australia, who is recorded in Sydney singing a song from Queensland. So there's a lot of cultural exchange and connection in that particular set of circumstances, and it would be really, I think, something that would enrich our collection a lot if we understood more fully how it was that this particular recording came to be, and more about the life of this remarkable person who contributed what I think is an incredibly valuable and important part of our collection, the National Library's first recording in an Indigenous language, to my knowledge. But there is other critically important early material as well in the collection. And I mentioned the National Library of Australia's folklore collection, and that has been, I think, a really important way that Indigenous voices have been able to be heard. And one example to provide is a recording by John Callaghan from 1961, which features Willie Mackenzie singing hunting and fishing songs in a language that is unidentified, but is clearly an Aboriginal language from the Brisbane area. And again, collaboration would be a crucial way of moving forward and knowing more about the particular context of that recording. I think that I should say that the majority of material that we do have from Indigenous Australians, First Nations people in our collection, is not in Indigenous languages, although there are some unique and very important collections that are in Indigenous languages, such as the Martu collection, for example. Some important collections that are predominantly in English, of course, would be the Bringing Them Home collection, which is something that consists of around 340 interviews. Not all of those interviews were with members of the stolen generations. Some were with people who were involved in carrying out that process of child removal. But the overwhelming majority of material is from Indigenous people who were affected by those practices. And one of those interviews is conducted in Pitjantjatjara with the aid of an interpreter. We also hold a lot of other collections that shed light on important aspects of Australia's history, including the After the Apology collection of 31 interviews with Indigenous people, the 7 Years On Continuing Life Histories of Aboriginal Leaders Oral History Project, the Indigenous Australian Nurses and Midwives Project, the Indigenous Ex-Servicemen and Women Oral History Project, and a range of other collections. There are also Indigenous voices in a great majority of our other collections too, which range from the Australian 1938 Oral History Collection, the Australian Generations Oral History Project, which looks at different generations of Australians and compares and contrasts their experiences, the Australian Lesbian and Gay Life Stories Project, the John Meredith Folklore Collection, and even the Klaus Haneke Snowy Mountain Schemes. So certainly, if you go through and have a look, there is a huge diversity of recordings relating to Indigenous people's experiences. And I think absolutely we would expect Indigenous voices to be included in any project that aimed to provide insight into Australian experiences, but we're keenly aware that the inclusion of those voices must be done as part of a deeply consultative process, and we're committed to working closely with Indigenous communities in this way. So, ethics and consultation have to be at the heart of the way that we collect oral history and folklore. And as I mentioned, we're keenly aware of the need to work very closely with individuals and communities when we collect and preserve material from and about Indigenous communities. And tomorrow you'll hear from the National Library of Australia's Indigenous curator, Rebecca Bateman, who has been involved in some really important work as far as that process of consultation and collaboration is concerned. Very significant work. But with regard to oral history and folklore, I do want to emphasise a few points here. Firstly, that material is always preserved and treated according to the wishes of a person or a community. Today, people fill out rights forms after doing an interview, and they're able to change the conditions of that form of access at any time. Secondly, we're always led by the people who are interviewed. There have been many occasions where a person has wanted to have their story or their history recorded, but they haven't wanted to make that material publicly available. So, of course, we follow those guidelines always with access conditions and restrictions. We also recognise the crucial work that is conducted by other institutions with regard to the collection of material about and by Indigenous Australians. IATSIS, and I've just noticed, unfortunately, that an A that should be on there isn't, so I apologise for that. We recognise the important contribution that other collecting institutions make in this area. For example, IATSIS has the most extensive collection of material relating to Indigenous Australians of anywhere in the world, and have an oral history collection consisting of approximately 40,000 hours of sound. I've been deeply moved today by hearing the stories of people who have driven efforts to preserve preserve Indigenous languages and regenerate the use of that language, and who have really reflected on what the use of language means on a very personal level, and the way that language is and can be so closely tied to identity. And I think that as the National Library continues to collect material, we see oral history and folklore as being a really critical and unique way of obtaining valuable perspectives for Australian history and society more broadly. We believe that oral history provides, and folklore provide, an invaluable means of reflecting the experiences and contributions of Indigenous communities and people, that it provides a means of ensuring that culture is maintained, and that it provides a way of sharing knowledge about Australia's past and present. And we have a responsibility, a very profound responsibility, as keepers of Australia's memory, to build and maintain a collection that reflects the diversity of Australia, the voices of people who have contributed to this country for over 65,000 years. I wanted to focus today on material from our collection that shows evolution over time and why oral history and folklore are so important. We've heard about particular efforts to preserve language, so I thought that I would focus in on the way that some of that's playing out in interesting ways. So Rob Willis is a very prolific folklore collector for the National Library of Australia, and he has documented the efforts that are being done at Forbes North Public School to teach the Wiradjuri language to people. So I just wanted to play you what I think is a really fantastic example of language regeneration which we have in our folklore collection. So here we go.
We'll now be saying welcome to country. Ladies and gentlemen, I am welcoming you to Wiradjuri country. Wiradjuri people are happy that you've all come.
We are now singing the greeting song.
We will now be singing the body song.
it's a really fantastic recording which has been made accessible online, I think. So if you'd like to listen to it, it's a really good one to listen to. And if you sort of follow through, they then go on to sing Waltzing Matilda, which I think does sound a lot better in Wiradjuri. So it's a pretty great recording and a really lovely way to sort of see that regeneration. And we're very proud to have it in our collection. Rob Willis, as I mentioned, is quite a prolific and really important part of the way that we collect material in our collection more broadly, but he also went down to Tasmania where he recorded a workshop where efforts are being made to regenerate Palawakani, so a language reconstruction project workshop. So this is just an image that shows you that workshop in process, and we have the recording of this as well. So possibly something that could be used as a teaching tool for people who might wish to engage more with the language. So it really has that kind of significance. And again, we're very proud to have material like this in our collection, but the collection of this sort of material can only be done with the strong support and involvement of Indigenous people themselves. So that's always very important. Another recording that I wanted to focus on as we sort of have a look at material relating to Australia's Indigenous population is from the Torres Strait Islander Songs Project. And I think a really important way about how culture can be transmitted through song. So I'd like to share with you a little bit of a song that Salu Sabasio sings. So I've got a map which shows you, I guess, where the Torres Strait Islands are in relation to Australia's mainland. So you can sort of see that they're there. It's a little bit small, but Ayama or Yam Island, which is where the Salu Sabasio is from, is a very small community that has a population of around 330 odd people. So it was a really fantastic opportunity to obtain material that speaks so richly to the culture and heritage of people from Torres Strait, and to include language Kalai Laga Ya from the central and western Torres Strait Islands. So Salu Sabasio was born in 1933 and undertook the recording in 2007. And in the recording, she speaks about a lot of topics, including marriage, children, her active involvement in the community, her life as a teacher and nursing aide, returning back to the community where she had been a child, a strict culture. And she also talks a lot about being proud of her culture and the way that it was really important for her to record that culture for other people to learn from, including through singing. So I'll just share with you a little bit. As you'll hear when she starts to talk, she's trying to think about a song that she could sing with just one person. So that makes sense. There's just one person being interviewed. And she talks about how she's choosing to sing a song about the wind. And I think this is a beauty and I think the potential and wonder of oral history. She says that she's going to sing a song about the wind, and the recorder actually picks up sort of the wind in the background as she begins. So if you listen closely, you can hear that, and I think it's just wonderful. So I'll just play a little bit of this if I can.
Just think of one song that come across my mind. I got that many, but I try to pick the right one where I can sing all by myself. This song I will sing about the wind that circle around the community. From Mobiok Point to Kona, from Kona to Kodakal. Kodakal is over there on the north side of the village. And Olympia, that's where all the Larry and Taide live. The song is like this. Nabeka wa mud, baltai nula, oh, mamui raunal tiai, mabui. Ukino pa mabio paina rema nupa kona remo gar kuki buba.
I would certainly, again, this is a recording that is accessible through our system, so I'd really encourage you to listen to it if you do get the chance, because it's really very beautiful. And again, I feel very fortunate that we're in a place where we are able to preserve this material with the active agency and involvement and consent of people, which of course is critical. So I'm not too sure how I'm going for time, so I think I'm okay. Okay, yep. Because I do want to say something about the Pacific, which is, I guess, a topic that is close to my heart. So as well as obviously Indigenous voices from Australia. So I should mention that my mother is a Fijian speaker, so it's quite a wonderful thing for me to actually go through the catalogue, and I was very touched to find that we do hold material that is in Fijian, and that was really quite a moving experience. And I would hope that other people from other parts of the Pacific will also be able to find something that speaks to them in that same way, but also that Australians more broadly will be able to immerse themselves in our oral history and folklore collection and find something that does connect them with the richness of the material and our relationship with that part of the world. And again, in terms of collecting material from the Pacific, we recognise the remit of other institutions to collect in this way. Paradisic, for example, and the Australian National University are both doing really good things as far as the collection of material is concerned, and institutions in the Pacific themselves are also really doing outstanding things to preserve culture. As far as the National Library is concerned, probably the largest strength that we have in this area is material from Papua New Guinea, which makes sense in that Papua New Guinea is very close to Australia. I think at the closest point there's about 6 kilometres of distance between Papua New Guinea and Australia, but also that we have a long and very involved relationship in terms of governance and that sort of thing. So we have a lot of material, including the Jim Thinkleton collection of 34 recordings with Tole people, and a lot of those interviews are in Pidgin English. We have the Percy Cochrane collection, which includes 15 recordings of customs and music. I mentioned the Fijian material, and that came from a South Pacific Arts Festival that was held in 1972. And at that festival, the National Library of Australia commissioned somebody from the Conservatorium in Sydney to go over and to record reels and reels of material, which they did. And the material is mostly in English, but there's 42 recordings from places such as Tonga, Fiji, Vanuatu, the Cook Islands, Gilbert and Ellice Islands, New Caledonia and Samoa. So one of my favourite recordings from that collection was a Fijian meke, which is a ceremonial sort of music with a very heavy drum beat that's done in occasions of celebration. If I was to play it, you'd largely just hear a drum beat, so I chose not to do that, but it is a great thing to listen to. It's really wonderful. Okay. So, being mindful of time, I will talk about another thing that I think is a great strength, which is that we have material like this. So, obviously Australia has a large population of Pacific Islanders who do live in this country, and again, Rob Willis, our folklore collector, has captured the voices of people singing in Samoan in a country town in New South Wales, in the country town of Griffith. So I think that that's quite a wonderful thing as well. So just to give you a little snippet of that. It was very hard to limit myself to 3 selections, so I could have kept going, but I will be mindful of time and just continue to say that one of the most gratifying things I think for us is that we see examples of people collecting with the material that we hold in our collection in very powerful ways. And for example, last year we had a visit from some women from the Anadilla Services Aboriginal Corporation on Groot Etland, and they were given a tour of the library, which was really great. And when they came down to the oral history and folklore section, we were able to play them some recordings that were made in 1972, and they were amazingly able to provide us with the full names of the singers, and they identified one of the singers as being the grandfather of a band that's currently singing today, and we were able to make them a copy of the recording, which they were able to take back to the grandson to have his grandfather as he continues to perform. So we thought that was just really fantastic and a wonderful example of the types of things that we like to be doing and working in a really collaborative way. And it was just a really joyful and wonderful moment for us in oral history and folklore. So to finish, I think I'd just like to wrap up by acknowledging the enormous privilege that the team in oral history and folklore have, and of course the National Library of Australia more broadly, in being able able to include such important material in our collection, and we've heard really meaningful stories about what language means to people and the central role that it does play. So I'd like to thank you for listening to me today, and really appreciate your time. So I had a little bit about where we're going into the future, but Rebecca Bateman will be able to talk about some great ways that we're collaborating into the future. So I will let her sort of brief you fully on some exciting directions that we're going into. If you have any questions at all, my email address is there. So thank you. Cheers.
We'll grab our two speakers for a bit of a Q&A and breakdown of their sessions. Some great presentations. I love the story of the Quandamooka recordings because it ties in really well with the current collection of Cook in the Pacific. Moreton Island, of course, being named after Lord Moreton. James Douglas, I think his name was, a Scot, who in February 1768 issued secret hints to Cook, Banks and Solander prior to the sailing of the Endeavour, which, and he says that in his phone, which not many Australians know of, but I find amazing, and they're actually in the display upstairs. And it was Lord Moreton who said to the expedition, the Endeavour, that they are to treat with kindness and understanding any Indigenous people encountered. And he urged Cook and his scientists to show the utmost patience and forbearance with respect to the natives of several lands where the ship may touch. And in doing so, he actually said that no European nation has the right to occupy any part of their country or settle among them without their voluntary consent. Conquest over such people can give no just title because they could never be the aggressor. So it's an interesting that you've got a Scot telling an English ship and captain that they really can't claim the land. And if you go upstairs, you can actually see those hints. And I think that for me, when I go through the exhibition upstairs, starting with those hints and then going through to Cook's secret instructions and then going through the wonderful other parts of the Cook exhibition upstairs, it really puts it into perspective. And interestingly enough, Lord Moreton is spelt with no E, but in translating Cook's diary, I think they put an E in. So that's why we get Moreton Bay and Lord Moreton. All right, I digressed there very badly. You could tell I'm a bit of a Cook fanatic, so I could talk for hours about Cook. We might have a bit of Q&A, so if you've got a question, just pop your hand up on any of the two topics, but I might start the ball rolling while we get some questions around. Nick, I wanted to talk about challenges for the community. What are the challenges for the community in accessing online material?
Which community?
Wonkemaya, for example. You're setting up Wonkemaya, they want to get a lot of resources back to their community. What are the challenges for them in doing so?
Well, one of the main challenges is actually getting the material in digital form. If it's held by a collecting institution which is operating on a sort of fearful basis and they don't want to release the material, then it could be very difficult. So there are language centres all over the country. Wonkemaya is one of them in Port Hedland, but there are many language centres. They act as local repositories for information, and they'll try and get information from places like National Library or IATSIS and bring it back to the local community so that it can be used, so that people can look at stuff and relearn it, so it actually becomes a living resource. So the real issue is, how do you get that material from the collecting institutions? Firstly, get it at all, and secondly, get it in a meaningful form that is something that you can use. So I suppose they're the challenges that I see.
Are there cultural challenges as well with getting the material back?
Well, yeah, of course there are, but language centres are typically run by an Aboriginal management committee which would deal with that. So with the Bates material, of course, there was a big issue for me about how do you deal with the fact that it represents so many different places and people, and there was no way that I was going to be able to get out and consult with the descendants who would number by now in the thousands. So I took that material, I took it out to language centres and conferences of Aboriginal people with some fear, but nevertheless I was always greeted very kindly, so that was good. People were very grateful to see this material being made accessible.
Thank you. Charlene, what's the challenges on the other side of the coin with the collecting institutions and cultural institutions in returning those materials?
I think that we'd always be guided by the communities themselves. So certainly going forward in terms of collecting oral history and folklore material, there would not be efforts to undertake projects unless they were driven and really had that key involvement, I think, from Indigenous communities. That's really the critical part of however we go forward. So the development of a consultation process has been really important. So certainly that, I think that awareness, it's been really gratifying to see that we are aware that things must be done properly and that the material is of value if it is of value to the Indigenous community. And we always have to follow the guidelines that are set out and specified by those communities regarding access. So I guess oral history is, we have thought about these questions around access for quite some time. Certainly rights forms and things like that do give us an opportunity to talk to people about exactly what's involved. And I guess it's interesting to see that in some ways with, say for example, the Wiradjuri language, that the wide decimation of that and sort of dissemination of sort of putting that online and making it accessible to a lot of people could be part of a really valuable project of cultural regeneration. But of course there would be other material that we do hold that would be deeply inappropriate for us to make accessible or to show in any sort of public way. So the critical key and the only way to move forward is to always involve the people who are descendants from or who have contributed that material. And I think that is the only way that we can continue to work successfully in this area. And I am proud of the collection that we have, and I think that it's a great thing that it has been built up in the way that it has, but also very proud that for a long time the National Library has been aware that you have to be very respectful when you work with communities, but also in terms of how oral history can be used.
Thank you. Here comes the microphone, Jackie.
Thank you. What advice would you give a community or a community group or individuals who are right at the very beginning of their journey on reviving their language? And just one piece of advice from your vast experiences.
This might be one for you, Nick, given...
Jackie, I think you're in a better position than I am to answer that question.
Like in setting up Wonka Mai, if you had to do it again...
Well, no, I think, look, there are some great models around. We know there are great models for language revitalisation projects. I think getting primary materials back and using them is a really important part of it. And, you know, just actually looking through the sort of stuff that Kim was talking about with the Lavas material, you know, having this wealth of material recorded with somebody in the 1930s and using that, but of course finding what resources there are within the community and how many people are still speakers or have memories. And I think those things can work together because you bring this back into the community, it jogs people's memories, and then it enriches the record. And then you've got all these great models, the master-apprentice model, where you have somebody who still speaks the language talking to a younger person, language nests that we heard about from Hawaii and New Zealand. So there are a lot of good examples like that. But getting the resources, I think, is really, really important. Can I ask a question? I just want to ask, have you ever had the situation where, you know, because you talk about the community, but what if, you know, part of the community says we want this to be openly accessible to everybody, and somebody else says no, you can't do that? What do you do in that situation?
Well, we'd obviously have to go back and have a look at and see what was, how did we come across the material in the first place. There'd be this would be something we'd take very seriously and would involve quite a lot of work. And really just, you know, ultimately, you know, who was a sort of exchange with, but we would never want to make anything accessible if it was going to cause great distress to people. So you would be weighing up a lot of ethical questions and trying to come up with a solution that ultimately meant that most people were in a position where they could feel happy and confident with the way that the National Library had proceeded in a very ethical way. And we have been able to negotiate that so far. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Nick. I think a lot of cultural institutions across Australia face that issue across their various collections. Any other questions?
Hi. Is this working? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm Linda Barwick. I also work for Paradisic. I just wanted to raise another issue which I think we're finding more and more, especially in an online environment, which is that communities aren't necessarily in one place. They can be quite distributed communities, and of course there's an incredible diaspora, for example, in Australia of people from Papua New Guinea or the Pacific. So I'm just interested in how you conceptualise that kind of broader idea about what constitutes a community.
I mean, it's a really interesting question, and it's one that actually we've been thinking about because a sort of very tangential question like that came up earlier this week. So, and I think that the whole position of people who migrate to a particular country more broadly and how they sort of fit into the maintaining culture and language is in different environments is a really interesting one. So, you know, if, for example, I mentioned that I myself do have a mother who speaks Fijian as a first language, yet that cultural transmission has not continued really to the extent that I would like it to have done so. But, I guess on a personal level, I would just say that certainly gives me an awareness that the cultures from the Pacific are vibrant and alive within Australia. So when we see things, I find it really exciting to see a Samoan congregation in Griffith transmitting culture in that particular way. So I definitely think there's a substantial population of Samoan people in Australia that I think is around 76,000. And that is a really large grouping. We have to acknowledge that when we talk about the Samoan experience, a very large part of that involves contact and life in Australia. So when I talk about the Pacific, I don't think that the Pacific is something that is removed from Australia, but I think that there is a diaspora, there is cultural contact and movement, and that as we do oral histories, we should always attempt to include that as well. So I would be really excited to look at projects that do talk about that. We do projects about the Scots in Australia, for example, really exciting things about how culture is maintained over generations in a different environment. It would be very interesting, again, to do projects that talk about what you mentioned. So I think that that's a really good point and would certainly be worth capturing that material.
Nick, did you want to answer? Okay. Any other questions? We're going to break for afternoon tea in a couple of minutes. I'll ask a question to both of you. 2019 being the UN International Year of Languages, if you could have a wish list of where you want to be at the end of the year, how do you see the theme and the momentum of Indigenous languages helping you or assisting you in your various roles? So in working with communities in WA and the Wonka mob, but also from a collecting institution point of view. And Nick, you said straight up that so many people think there was just one Noongar language and one Australian language. So what would be your wish list by the end of the year?
Well, certainly, it's a very low bar, but it would be good if people understood, if people could actually name 10 Australian languages and know where they come from, because I think they can name 10 North American languages, but they can't name 10 Australian languages, so maybe that's a very low bar. But if they could engage with local languages and get to understand more about the local situation, and if we could just have a lot more resources going into language centres, developing materials, getting materials like the national collecting institutions, identifying language materials in their collections so that people could go there and say, okay, I want everything in this language, and know that they'll find it. So there are all kinds of links between, for instance, IATSIS, the National Library, NFSA, that could be made, and all the state libraries, which would really help to do that. So these are more sort of institutional things, but I think they would all lead to a flow of resources back into communities where people could access them and use them. So.
I think I'd just start with a broader idea, which would be I would really love at the end of this year if people really appreciated the significance and meaning of language, and that more and more Australians across the country really realised why this matters and the urgency of really taking action to preserve and continue culture and language. So to me that would be really important on a broader level. Then I think we need to look and think about what role can the National Library play in a really collaborative way to help facilitate that. Are there ways that we can continue to push forward and work with communities to make sure that languages, say for example with the Wiradjuri recordings that we have, are there ways that we can make recordings available in different ways or in broader ways? Material that we can put online with the consent of the community that could perhaps be part of helping to lift that awareness and to help the regeneration, because I think that the fact that we have that potential to make our material so widely available is something that does give the National Library of Australia such a unique role. So I think that really just, I do genuinely feel very proud that the National Library does have a very good record of doing work in terms of collecting language and preserving language, and that we now are in a position where we have the best possible technology to make it available, but consultation's key to that. So a very clear consultation process, again, which has emerged. So I think broader public awareness, us using our resources to do what we can do to support the regeneration and continued vibrancy of languages, and I think continuing to do what we do in a way that is culturally appropriate and that supports and helps Indigenous communities.
All right, thank you very much. Any other questions? All right, well we might conclude this session. Thank you very much, Charlene and Nick.